time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. It's a live line today. I'm a little confused. Old habits die hard. I usually start these at about 10 a.m., 10:30 Central Time, and I kind of got the time screwed up this morning. We're on schedule, actually. It was supposed to start at 9 a.m. Central Time, so a little bit of an early start. But that's good. We've got an old friend, an old buddy, an old pal coming back on podcast by George today, and it's Captain John Cox. Let me get that thing off of. Why is that on there? I don't like that. If I could get that little logo off of there, I would. Yeah, I can take that off of there. There we go. There's a good look at the captain on the live line. And of course, Captain John Cox. Everybody that watches the show is familiar with him. And if you've caught any of the the shows on television that I like to watch, like Mayday and Why Planes Crash, and he's on those all the time. I see him on there. Those are on the internet now. They're available free. Anybody can watch those. He's also authoring every week or two a column in the USA Today, Ask the Captain, on all aviation questions, large and small. And then, of course, when anything comes up that's of national network level type news, you'll see the captain as the aviation expert on Ask the Captain. And of course, he also has an aviation safety company, SOS Safety Operating Systems, out of Washington, D.C. That's kind of his day job. But let's get him on here and get that graphic down and say good morning, hello, hi, how are you, to the captain, Captain John Cox. Hi, John.
Hi, George. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on in here. We got a lot of things to talk about today. And as I always talk about on the podcast, aviation safety seems to intersect with everything. I spend a good deal of time talking about politics and the news, world events, and aviation runs through all of these things. And it's top of mind right now because of the holidays and the flight delays that people are experiencing. Everybody's out traveling. Everybody's got cabin fever. Everybody wants to move around. And the grid, the daisy chain that is flight scheduling has been markedly affected. Now, we're going to get to that, but I want to bring this up on screen here. I want to talk about this to start with. This is just something that I saw recently. This is the captain's world. These are the types of things that he looks at very closely. This was from the Associated Press, Dateline Miami. The crash landing of a jetliner that caught fire on the runway at Miami International Airport with 126 people on board had passengers screaming and panicking, witnesses said. People were very frightened. RED Air Flight 203 passenger Marcio Davis told the Miami Herald people were grabbing the seats to keep from spinning around. I don't know exactly what that means, but the fire started Tuesday after the MD-82 jetliner's landing gear collapsed on arrival from the Dominican Republic. And Miami-Dade Aviation Department spokesman Greg Chin said. Bring up the next slide here. 3 passengers were taken to a hospital with minor injuries while the others were bused to the terminal. Passenger Paola Garcia said she thought she was going to die. I started running and I jumped and I thought it was going to explode, she told WSVN. Well, the plane came to a stop on the grass beside a runway where it was doused with chemicals to put out the fire. At least 3 firefighting vehicles responded. Emergency crews reached the plane in a minute and a half, according to Miami-Dade County Mayor. Let's see here. Can I get that to come down? Well, let's see. That'll. I'm having a little trouble reading that. Okay, so what happened here is a miracle. The mayor, Daniela Levine Cava, told reporters. Airport officials said in a tweet that the collapse of the front landing gear and the nose of the aircraft appeared to cause the fire. RED Air is a small, low-fare airline that launched last November and only flies between Santo Domingo and Miami. Okay, I'll bring that article down. Maybe that's a good place to start, Captain. A lot of people that travel, myself included, when I was flying about the country. I mean, we think of the major airlines and we think of the general aviation pilots that are out there, but there's a lot of carriers and a lot of them that most people aren't even familiar with. The RED is this particular airline, and it only has one flight schedule, right?
That's what I understand. I was not familiar with this airline until this accident happened. I think, as is so often the case, there's some things that we will find in the initial reports that later investigation will come up and have us look in other areas. The nose gear collapse, I think, was a secondary part of it. It looks like one of the main gear actually collapsed, and as that happened, that opened the wing to start venting jet fuel. Now, one thing to consider in here is jet fuel is a type of kerosene, so it's not nearly as volatile as gasoline. So when the passengers, and I understand why they would feel this way, said the airplane's going to blow up, that's not generally the case. What this does say, George, is how well the evacuation went, and the fact that the certification for these airplanes, and this was an MD-80, the requirement to get everybody out of the airplane in 90 seconds, that's a good rule. And this proves it because they got everybody out of that airplane. The crash fire rescue crews did an outstanding job. They got right there. They immediately started knocking down the flames, giving the passengers not only time, but a pathway out from the airplane. So this was an older airplane. There will be an investigation as to what caused the failure. But if it's a gear failure, on rare occasion, those things do happen. It's how the crew handles it after that. And in this case, the crew did pretty well.
And there's a lot of people flying on MD-80 still. It's an older aircraft, as you mentioned, but there's a lot of those in the air, right?
Not so many anymore. There's a
really?
few around. But there's the MD-90s. I think most of those are even still parked. You see the derivative of it, the Boeing 717, they're still around a little bit. But more of the MD-80s have gone to secondary markets like the freighters and things like that. You see them in airlines such as this RED or Red Airlines, but they're older airplanes and they have tended to migrate into secondary markets.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked a little bit about the passengers, because if you're on one of these, I mean, you can understand why they're afraid. It reminds me of a musician that I like a lot that I follow, John Mellencamp. He had a heart attack one time, and one reporter asked him, said, "Yeah, I understand that you had a mild heart attack, John." And he said, "Well, let me tell you something. When you're having one, they ain't none of them mild." I mean, it'll get your attention real quick.
The one thing that I would say, and this is a problem that we face, is if you are in an evacuation, if you hear the words evacuate, 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 and you need to start getting out of the airplane, don't take your bags with you. Leave them in the airplane, and don't spend any time videoing how you're jumping down the slide. And in recent years, both of those have become an increasing problem. And you're not only putting yourself at risk, but you're putting your fellow passengers at risk because you don't move as quickly. And you have a greater tendency for that bag to cause people to trip or to impede your ability to evacuate the airplane. So leave it. Just get out of the airplane, protect yourself and your fellow passengers. Once you're on the ground, get away from the airplane and follow the instructions from the firefighters and police and flight crew.
Well, yeah, because there's nothing that you can't buy of wherever you're at. I mean, unless you're traveling with family, heirlooms are precious. Even that stuff isn't worth your life. So, I mean,
Exactly.
Come on, yeah, use some common sense here. Okay, I want to bring this up here. We got a lot of things to talk about with the captain, and these things kind of catch my eye, and I want to talk about this very briefly. Now, this is right out of the heartland, man. This is right out of the state of Iowa. An Illinois pilot made an emergency landing Tuesday in a Jasper County soybean field after running out of fuel on the way to Ankeny. James Meyer and a passenger were flying from Illinois to Ankeny Regional Airport when his aircraft ran out of fuel and he made the landing in a field north of Sully on South 48th Avenue East around 11 a.m., according to news release from the Jasper County Sheriff's Office. This would have been a beautiful sunny day. Deputies made phone call contact with Meyer and responded to the emergency landing. So the dude called somebody on his cell phone. He was able to land without injuries. Meyer refueled the plane after landing and took off again just before 1 p.m., the release said. The Federal Aviation Administration is investigating the emergency landing. And there's the plane, there's the field. I mean, this can be done. This does happen. And I guess that's my question for this one, Captain. Why does this happen? I mean, there are a lot of people that never run out of fuel in their cars. How does a pilot run out of fuel in his plane?
I would say that it may not have had the best pre-flight planning, and because there are reserve requirements. So you plan your trip, the destination that you're going to go to. You take into account the wind. You come up with how long it's going to take you, and then you can and you're required to have, under visual flight rules, a minimum of 30 minutes additional fuel on board. Instrument flight rules are a bit different and require even more reserve fuel. But when you flight plan for a trip, you always have reserve fuel. And in this case, for whatever reason, that pre-flight planning didn't match what happened. I'm glad that they were able to pull off a very successful landing. Obviously, it does not look like the airplane's was injured, and I'm glad that they were able to get it out of the field and get it on its way. But I think that the person, the captain or the pilot flying the airplane, is going to have some interesting questions to answer from the FAA.
Now, I know some people, I don't know exactly why, but they'll run their cars down a little lower on fuel when prices are high for fuel like it is. Now, that wouldn't apply to a guy in a plane. For instance, he wouldn't be flying that plane into Ankeny or Des Moines on empty, thinking that he can get lower price fuel there. That wouldn't make any sense, would it?
It wouldn't. There are apps that provide pilots with fuel prices, so you know where to go to get the least expensive fuel. But to run it that tight, I don't see a justification for that.
Okay, good. Well, it's not a major news story, obviously, but I just kind of wanted to run through it because it does happen. I'll never forget when I was a young man here at Des Moines International Airport, a guy landed his small plane in a parking lot across the street in a Target store. I mean, I think he crashed a little bit, but he walked away from it. I mean, that's how close he had cut it. I mean, he was just a couple of 100 yards away from the airfield, and it ended up in a Target store parking lot. Yeah, that's a fact. Okay, let's go to this next story because this is a big deal, folks. And I want to get to this. Let me bring this up to where I can read it on full screen. Now, this is Forbes reporting that travelers are returning to the skies in 2022 for domestic and international flights. And we know that. And God, it's also packed out on the interstate for people in cars. This summer is going to be the busiest travel season since the COVID-19 pandemic began. However, many flights are being canceled or delayed. What is the root cause? Here are a few factors you should know if you're planning to travel. Now, Forbes is reporting that pilot shortages are the primary reason. Many delays and cancellations are because of an industry-wide pilot shortage. In addition, the legacy carriers and regional operators don't have enough staff for various reasons. As a result, airlines are combining routes or discontinuing services when necessary to offset staffing shortages. This move is similar to the height of the pandemic when carriers reduced to minimal service as travel demand plummeted. However, consolidating flights to conserve pilots and reduce operating expenses isn't as simple as waving a magic wand. Pilots can only fly planes they are certified to operate. For example, a pilot certified for small commuter jets won't be able to fly a long-haul Big Bird aircraft, which is larger and holds more passengers. These delays and the risk of cancellations are resulting in a record high number of July 4th road trips this year out on the road. People prefer the flexibility of driving a vehicle despite the higher gas and other problems connected with that. Now, long-term consequences from the pandemic layoffs. Domestic and international airlines are still recovering from the staff layoffs in 2020 when the industry wasn't sure how soon air travel would rebound to pre-pandemic levels. That time is now, but former employees have changed occupations or don't want to risk another layoff. Okay, let's bring the captain back in here because I want to talk about this. This is interesting to me. Captain, these people, like a lot of folks, kind of they got laid off or they walked away from their jobs in the pandemic. The airlines have had a lot of negative news lately with the unruly passengers and the issues in the air. A lot of the older people in the airline industry were probably hoping to retire out. Is it? Can you put your finger on any one thing, or is it a combination of all the aforementioned?
It's a combination of a lot of things, George. First, when the pandemic hit, and the airlines had no choice but to dramatically pull down flight schedules. One of the things they did was, in an effort to minimize cost, was they offered early retirements to a lot of senior pilots. It made perfect sense at the time. The consequence of that was that they didn't have to furlough as many junior pilots, and that was all good. They furloughed a number of flight attendants, and they offered flight attendants the same sort of early retirement benefits. So the staffing levels went down significantly. They also, a number of pilots, including a good number of friends of mine, their airplanes were parked and they couldn't fly it. Entire fleet types were parked. So to try to get trained on a new type of airplane, it was months before they could get to school and get through training. So the consequence was the total available pilot pool at the airlines went down because of the pandemic and the reduced flying schedule. Well, when the demand started up, it is not something you can do just overnight. You can't just snap your fingers and have pilots go back to work. It takes months to get them retrained. So from the beginning, the airlines found themselves with the demand outstripping the supply of not only pilots, but cabin staff, maintenance. It was almost across the industry, as well as customer service staff, ramp agents. Those people could be brought back more quickly, but so the airlines found themselves pushing the limits of what their staff could actually support. And as they were bringing these people on, the demand kept increasing. So that push to stretch the limit of what they could support with pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, that's got continued to push, which is one of the reasons you're seeing some of the pilot unions now saying, look, we've been working overtime for months here. We can't continue at this pace. All the airlines are hiring at a major rate as quickly as they can get people through training. The consequence of that is, from the major airlines, they pick a lot of folks from the regional carriers. The regional pilots move up to the major airlines because the pay and conditions is significantly better. So the regional airlines find themselves with a high turnover, and they too are trying to hire pilots. So the candidate pool of qualified pilots overall begins to shrink. And now if you read from the regional carriers, they're seeing a 30 to 50% no-show rate in their new hire classes. So all of this it's not one thing, it's dominoes. And so in the summer, when you have things like thunderstorms and abnormal operations, when schedules are disrupted, under normal conditions, you would have reserve crews that you could put into place to get the airplane, pick it up, and fly it on. Well, right now, those reserve crews don't exist. And so it's harder for the airline to operate in what we call irregular operations. When the things are disrupted and you have pilots, flight attendants, and airplanes that are not in their location, because this is a very carefully choreographed process to run a scheduled airline. The mixture of having the right pilots at the right place with the right airplanes, with the right flight attendants, for every flight, it requires a huge amount of prior scheduling. When it's disrupted, it takes days to get it reestablished. And right now, they don't have the level of reserves that they've had in the past. And so finally, you're beginning, they don't have any choice in some cases, but to do some cancellations. And you're seeing now they're saying that we're going to reduce the schedule in an effort to try to increase the number of reserves so that they can better handle irregular operations.
All right. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, Captain, because and it's great to have you on the show because this is your world. I mean, aviation safety. I mean, I'm hearing you say all of this, and it's kind of in the background. I mean, are you concerned? Are you worried? Is safety at risk because of the circumstances that you've described?
No, I don't think so. I'm not seeing the standards come down. So the qualifications of the crew members, that hasn't changed. The number of crew members have changed, but the quality of the training is still very high. The caliber of the individuals flying the airplanes, the cabin staff working on the airplanes, the maintenance technicians working on the airplanes, all of those are being maintained. So the safety net underneath the operations day to day, I don't see it eroding.
How about the stress and the fatigue? Just those two things on these folks. I'm glad you mentioned the maintenance and the ground staff. I mean, are they afflicted with the same type of issues that you described earlier?
They are, and you make a good point. The fatigue issue, the cumulative fatigue issue, is a problem. They're all the airlines with all of the staff members, they will ask you on occasion to work overtime, and that's fine. We're all in it together. It's a team effort to try to safely move people from one place to the next. But when you do that on a regular basis, that cumulative fatigue mounts up, and the concern is that you get fatigue-induced performance degradation, and this is what some of the pilot unions are saying is they're at the brink of right now, and that either one of two things, they either have to find a way to get more pilots trained, but the training system is pretty well at capacity, or the airlines have got to pull back their schedule until they can meet the staffing requirements so that they don't have this cumulative fatigue. And what I'm reading in recent days is the airlines are acknowledging that, and they are in fact pulling the schedule back, I think starting in September.
And the interesting thing that you mentioned there is that a lot of people will say, well, people just don't want to work in any endeavor. But it sounds like they're training pilots. There are people in the system coming in. Is that correct?
It is correct. Particularly the major airlines, they're able to fill their positions, their open positions, pretty regularly. But there's only so many simulators. There's only so many instructors so the system has a finite limit of pilots that can get through training. And then once they're through the simulator training, then they need instructor pilots that fly with them in their initial time, their what they call initial operating experience, to certify them in actual line operations. Then and only then are they fully qualified. So this process takes a while, and there are inherent limitations, and I'll call it bottlenecks, both in the amount of simulator time available, simulator instructors, and line check airmen that fly with the pilots once they are ready to get out on the line. And those are the constraints that we're seeing. The regional carriers have the same constraints, but they're having much more problem filling the slots. And a lot of the major airlines are hiring from the regionals, so the turnover is much greater. So the regionals are having a tougher time than the majors at this point.
Okay, let me bring this up on screen because you've mentioned this in ways just briefly here. Now, this is out of the USA Today. It's where you'll find the captain's columns. This is Dateline Dallas, USA Today. Hundreds of uniformed Southwest Airlines pilots stood in perfect lines in the scorching Texas sun at Dallas Love Field on Tuesday of this week, holding signs that blamed Southwest management for delays and cancellations that have upset passengers. Every once in a while, a motorist would honk or yell encouragement. Most passengers made a beeline for the security checkpoint inside the terminal. Now, the protest, which the union said drew up to 1,300 pilots, was the latest example of airline workers trying to put pressure on companies by taking their demands for higher pay directly to the flying public. Are they taking advantage? I don't know. Federal law makes it nearly impossible for airline unions to conduct legal strikes. Contract negotiations tend to drag out often for years. Southwest flight attendants have been working under an old contract since 2018. Last week, the Airline Pilots Association, which the captain was closely aligned with at one time, or ALPA, posted an open letter to Delta Airline customers saying its members empathized with travelers whose flights were delayed or canceled and blaming Delta management. The union said Delta has scheduled more flights than it has pilots to fly, and pilots are working record overtime hours, which the captain was talking about. Earlier this month, American Airlines pilots picketed near the New York Stock Exchange, and before that, at major airports. Some held signs such as "Frustrated with AA, so are we." And there's a photo of them. Now, this is down in Dallas. I don't know. So let me get this off screen here and bring the captain back to talk about this a little bit. My heart is always going to go out to the workers. I'm a lefty. I mentioned that we talk about politics and news a lot on the show, Captain. I'm going to look at these pilots and say, I talk about the CARES Act on the show as an example. All of these bailouts. I mean, the airlines are pretty well taken care of financially by us, the U.S. taxpayers and the government. They seem to do pretty well. It looks to me like they've got money to spread around. And so I'm looking at these pilots, and that's the side that I'm on. Now, you probably don't want to take sides, but kind of what's your overview, your analysis of a strike right now?
Well, I think right now we're at a point where the pilot groups, be it the Delta pilots, the American pilots, the Southwest pilots, and their respective union leadership, I think they're still in an educate the public mode. That the fact that it's not the crew members that are causing the cancellations. They're putting more airplanes in the schedule than you have pilots and reserves to normally crew. And they did this on a short-term period, and it worked because everybody was willing to fly some extra days and so forth. But you do get into cumulative fatigue. And this is what the pilots are saying, okay, enough of the forced overtime. And it's a valid concern. I don't think that you're seeing, as with any contract negotiation, pay is always going to be an issue. Working conditions is always going to be an issue. And that's true here too. But the case here is much more focused on staffing, so that the airlines provide the service to the passengers, to the freight shippers that is expected. And I think that right now that much more effort is going into the public education piece. Are the pilots using leverage to enhance their negotiating position? Of course they are. As the airlines, the management teams would if the situation were reversed. That's part of our just normal labor negotiation practice. But in this case, the crews do have a valid point that they've been working overtime. They've been trying to be part of the solution, but they've been increasing the schedules faster. They've been increasing the number of pilots, and it strained the system. And the fact that that strain is occurring, I think, is more at the core of what these pilots are saying and what they're trying to get the management teams to do.
I'm an old hockey guy. You don't ever want to mention the word shutout when a goalie's got a 0 on the board because it'll jinx him. My God, you may not. I mean, perish the thought of a strike. Southwest is an example. I think they're the largest domestic air carrier in the United States. My God, particularly over this holiday season or during the summer months, if those guys went on strike, guys and gals, holy buckets. I mean, I just can't imagine what would happen to that industry and to our economy and the lifestyle of Americans. I mean, it's something that you almost can't think about. I remember the Patco strike, the situation with Reagan back in the 80s when I was covering the news. But I mean, a real industry-wide strike. Is there any precedent for this, Captain? What would happen?
Well, there are cases in the past. There is precedent for individual airlines to strike. I mean, I remember an American Airlines flight attendant strike. I remember a U.S. Air pilot strike. So it has happened. It's extremely disruptive to everybody involved, and I think it's a last ditch. And I don't think the airlines want it. I don't think the pilot unions or the flight attendant unions or the maintenance technician unions, I don't think any of them want that to strike. I think that the idea is to come up with an acceptable compromise. But the key issue right now is staffing. It's the number of pilots available per airplane to make sure that it's adequately crewed for the intended schedule. And I think until that right now, I think is the thing that is number one on the list.
Well, you're uniquely qualified on a lot of the topics, and it's why I wanted to do this show right now that we've talked about here. And one thing that you're uniquely qualified, you're a senior captain. I mean, what we talk about at the opening of the show, you've got 14,000 hours in the cockpit of these major airline commercial jetliners, but it goes back to the golden era, I would call it, of a lot of different things, but maybe the airline industry. I look at these guys on strike and I'm thinking, my God, a lot of people would never think that they have it tough, that they have it hard, that they're not being paid enough. Nobody would have thought that back in the day. And in the day, I'm talking 10, 20, 30 years ago when you were up there, you may have issues and concerns, but pay and hours and that type of thing, we thought, the passengers, we never thought that would be on the pilots' minds, but it does appear like it is today. Has that world changed, do you think?
Oh, I definitely think so. I've been flying airplanes 52 years.
Wow.
I went into the airlines in 1980. So that's, 42 years ago. And so you're right. I was extremely fortunate to be part of a golden age in aviation. We didn't know it at the time, but looking in retrospect, it was a golden age. And did they push us hard? Of course they did. I mean, we flew a lot. We moved people all over the world, and we did so as safely as we possibly could. I think the difference now is that the push and the regulatory environment and the ability to get qualified pilots is harder than it was if you go back into the mid 80s, into the 90s. So there was an abundance of not only civilian but also military pilots in those days. So as the airlines would find themselves needing additional crew, that it wasn't hard to find. As a matter of fact, I know when my new hire class was hired, they had 10,000 applications and they selected 10 of us. So that was, and that's not the case today. Yeah. So I think that you're seeing it's a harder environment, air traffic control, more airplanes, the more complex airplanes. All of these things add up to increased fatigue levels. And I mean, I think the pilots clearly have a legitimate complaint about forced overtime being not just once or twice, but it being a regular part of day in, day out. Now, the one of the things that you hear is, well, pilots don't work that many days, and that is very, very, very deceptive. The number of days that a pilot works on the line may not be what a typical 9-to-5 office worker does. But when you factor in all of the training that they have to go through, the process of constantly interacting to bid the trips, which takes hours upon hours to do, all of these things, what the duty time requirements when the pilot or for that matter, the flight attendant, any of the flight crew members, it's almost double what they typically fly. So they're with the airplane for X number of hours, but then the administrative side, training side, and also takes about that much time, and you're away from home. So, when you're out on the road in long haul, and some pilots are out out away from home 20 days a month, and that's a lot. It has its cumulative fatigue effect on your personal life, and all of that adds up.
Yeah, I don't know anything about being an airline pilot, but it sounds like a little bit of my early career as a truck driver. I mean, that is a very hard life. You are on the road. You're a vagabond. I mean, you're in some ways like a carnival worker or something like that. And the one thing that we can't overstate or say enough is, even though we talk about the golden era, uh, compared to when you started, particularly here in the United States, it's much safer now than it was then, correct?
We did actually a study on that. I learned to fly in 1970, and if we had maintained the same level of safety that we had in 1970, which we thought at that time was pretty good, and we had just maintained that, there would be something over 60,000 additional fatalities that would have occurred. So we have not only improved the quantity of air travel and the quality of air travel, but the safety of air travel in these 52 years. It's been an amazing transition to watch and to be a part of.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, I want to get that's kind of the first half of our show here. I wanted to get to some of these other timely things, and this is something that we've talked about on the show, the captain, and I want to bring this up on screen. This is China Eastern Airlines flight MU5735, I think it is. So this shows the flight path of that ill-fated flight. Here it is at altitude at the top. This unusual, unprecedented, unbelievable descent, a little bit of an ascent, and then a descent to where it crashed. And I remember when we first talked about this, Captain, you were aware of that, and you said, "Oh, this is bad." It's pretty much. Would you say we can close this case or not?
Until the official report comes out, it's always open. And the Chinese government has committed to following the international protocols for accident investigation, which requires a final report. It's called ICAO Annex 13. They've committed to follow the protocols and standards of Annex 13. So I'm looking for the government to release a final report. I think they have all the information they need to do that. So I would encourage them to go ahead and publish it. But it's a tragic, tragic, tragic accident. The general consensus is based on the flight profile and other information that has been developed. It's been pretty widely reported that it was sadly an intentional act. And so this is an extraordinarily rare event, but it's very hard for me, actually, George, to understand this, because as a professional pilot, you spend your entire adult life training and then and doing everything you can to protect the jet. And to have someone do something deliberately that endangers the jet is just, it's beyond my ability to understand it. I just don't see how somebody could do that.
Yeah, and it's sickening and photo article, and this plane was caught by cameras, unbelievably. God, and again, to your word a little bit with this aviation issue, is the thing that can't be solved always going to be a possibility, or is there something that can be to prevent one in a cockpit from taking control of something like this?
There's been a lot of work done on this. After the German wings tragedy, the Europeans really started looking into modeling tests to see stress levels and so forth. And there was some work done that was encouraging, but I have not heard of any definitive test yet. Two things. One, the typical training that pilots go through is a pretty high stress environment, and that's by design. And so people that are having issues, it oftentimes will show up there as they're just not able to handle the stress of a simulator event with the abnormal conditions or emergencies that we get in simulator conditions. So that's one. Two, there is a uh, very much a almost a family type approach to flight crews. A lot of times we know each other, and we're constantly listening for, is somebody having problems with a child that's sick and they've burned up all their sick leave and they're fatigued because they're constantly dealing with this sick child, something like that. And generally speaking, uh, that word will get back to the management pilots and say, look, this person doesn't need to be sitting in the front of the jet right now. And the companies are pretty much have acknowledged that that's a case, and they're supportive of it. So the crews watch each other because we're all interdependent on each other. And so as the airplane pushes off the gate, the best assets you have are your fellow crew members and the training, so that you're prepared to deal with whatever comes up. And if you see somebody that doesn't indicate that they can perform that way, you generally will try to carefully and gently rotate them off the team.
And what about this particular investigation? We also talked about this with Chinese and Chinese authorities and the difference in the cultures and the animosity between the two countries and that type of thing. Were you all right with the investigation? Were you disappointed in it any way, or maybe surprised at the way that this progressed?
No, it went exactly the way that I thought it should go. The early on, the Chinese investigators were on scene, and that is, as the world standard, which I mentioned earlier, NX 13. They realized that they needed additional help. The manufacturer, Boeing, was there. The National Transportation Safety Board was there, and the minister, the minister of that was in charge, was said very quickly, "We're going to do this in accordance with ICAO NX 13," and I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard that. So they have followed that protocol. They've kept it pretty close to the vest. There hasn't been a whole lot of word in the background or the back channels as there are on many of them. But the general consensus is we know what happened, and I think the Chinese are trying to properly document it so that when they do put their report out, that it meets or exceeds the standards of Annex 13.
All right, let's bring this up to wrap up the show a little bit. This is a big item. This is a big issue. This is historic in the heartland. Tragedy and triumph. Bring this up on screen. That's a plane that you've seen a lot, Captain. Tell us about that.
It's a United Airlines DC-10, and the flight I think you're referencing is United Flight 232, that experienced an absolutely catastrophic engine failure, which resulted in the loss of all three hydraulic systems, something that was unprecedented and considered to be nearly impossible. And through some very, very creative airmanship, Captain Al Haynes and crew, along with Captain Denny Fitch, that was an instructor pilot that was riding on the airplane, managed to regain enough of the control to arrive in Sioux City under semi-controlled conditions, and not only get it on the airport, but to have a significant number of survivors. And this was pretty much unprecedented. To call them heroes would be an understatement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Captain knows all about this one. He's been on a show about it. Let me bring this up here, kind of just recover, say exactly what he was saying. So United Airlines Flight 232 is a regularly scheduled United Airlines flight from Stapleton International Airport in Denver to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, continuing to Philadelphia. On July 19th, 1989, the DC-10, registered as N1819U, serving the flight, crash landed in Sioux City, Iowa, after suffering a catastrophic failure of its tail-mounted engine due to an unnoticed manufacturing defect in the engine's fan disc, which led to the loss of many flight controls. Of the 296 passengers and crew on board, 112 died during the accident, while 184 people did survive. Now, despite the deaths, the accident is considered a prime example of successful Crew Resource Management, CRM. Again, this is a big part of the captain's life because of the large number of survivors and the manner in which the flight crew handled the emergency and landed the airplane without conventional control. It's also the deadliest accident in the history of United Airlines. And so this is out of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's kind of running through the timeline here. It took off from Denver at 2:09. It had a guy on board named Jerry Schemmel. He's a broadcaster, a sportscaster out of Denver. And he's been on Podcast by George. I'm going to play a couple of clips with Jerry with any luck here on a show that we did recently. At 3:16 p.m., a cracked fan blade in the rear engine disintegrated, causing the engine to fail while flying debris severed all 3 hydraulic lines and pierced the horizontal stabilizer. People on the aircraft heard a loud bang. Okay, so and the captain mentioned that was this explosion that took place, and I've got this film clip with Jerry. I want to play this because this was great stuff. Here's Jerry Schemmel talking about this moment in history.
Everything was smooth the first hour of the flight, 2-hour flight, George, as I said. And then 59 minutes into the flight, something happened that I think was sort of lost in the whole story of the crash. And that was this explosion aboard the plane. And to give you some idea of what it first sounded like and then it felt like, the first thing I thought was a bomb had gone off. Honestly, I did. I thought someone terrorists had planted a bomb on our plane. It had been detonated and we started to drop. And I remember, I don't know if you remember Pan Am 103. It was down by a terrorist bomb over Scotland.
Yeah,
that happened just had just six months before that. And I thought, in those moments, the same thing has happened to us. That a bomb has gone off. It's blown up the plane. We're going down. That's it for everybody. And as you might guess, panic took over the cabin and a lot of screaming. And I remember thinking this so clearly in my head through all this chaos of an explosion, the panic in the cabin, thinking to myself, all right, I got 2 questions. Number one, how many people are aboard this plane? Because I think my thought was, all right, how many people are going to be dead here in the next couple moments? And secondly, and the number 200 came into my head. I was almost 100 people off. There were 100 people more than that. The other question was, how long does it take a DC-10 to drop 37,000 feet? I wanted to know when we were going to hit the ground, when we were going to be ready for impact. And I had no idea how long that would take. But, after thinking those 2 things and questioning, having those 2 questions, about 30 seconds went by and you could feel the plane start to come up a little bit, kind of ease back out of that drop. And eventually, after probably 2 or 3 minutes, we actually leveled off again and felt like we were flying normal.
Okay, Captain. Again, I know that you're well aware of this. I want to bring this up on screen, and you can, and this looks confusing to people that aren't aware of this flight. This is the flight path. This is what they were having to do with these throttles and engines that you mentioned, and the ability, I think, only to turn right. Talk us through this a little bit.
The captain, Al Haynes, I knew him. Sadly, he has passed away. But when you talk to Al and you say, okay, the very first thing they did was try to use conventional flight controls, and the flight engineer said, we've lost all 3 hydraulic systems. And properly, okay, well, let's do the loss of 3 hydraulic systems checklist and see what we've got to work with here. And the flight engineer came back and said, there is no such checklist. And that was because no one ever thought that these triple redundant hydraulic systems, you could lose all 3 of them. And during this period of time, they're trying to maintain the airplane at least some semblance of control. And it was in a descending right turn. And so they had to get that right turn stopped so that they could work their way through it and get it pointed toward an airport. And they didn't really have a lot of control. But what they did have was the 2 engines underneath each wing. And by adjusting the power on one, they were able to stop this continuous right turn and even fly sort of in a straight direction. And so quickly they realized that they did have some limited control. And the next question is, where's the nearest airport? And then this Captain Denny Fitch, who is an instructor pilot on the DC-10, let the flight attendants know who he was, and if he could help in any way, he was more than happy to do so. Captain Haynes' comment was, "Quick, bring him up here. We need all the help we can get." And this crew, the flight engineer, the first officer, Captain Fitch and Captain Haynes, worked together to figure out how to control the jet with just these two engines under the wing that were still operative, and the jet itself was crippled. And I mean by that the explosion of the center engine, it resulted in airflow that was distorted. Consequently, the airplane was not easy to control even under normal circumstances. But if you see these series of turns, these right turns, they're working their way towards the Sioux City Airport, and they get there, and they're cleared to land on any runway. And Al Haynes makes one of the most unique and insightful comments back to the air traffic controllers. He says, "Oh, you want me to land on a runway?" He was just trying to get it to the airport. Mm-hmm. But it gave you some insight into the cool nature and the cool, calm, collected way that these four airmen worked together to get this crippled jet onto the airport, and over 180 people survived it.
We started off talking about a miracle, folks. This qualifies as an aviation miracle, and some of the best airmanship, I mean, really, in the history of modern aviation. And you can't say enough about the late great past Captain Al Haynes. Well, one of the things that I thought was remarkable is that he was communicating, the captain was, with the passengers. I mean, they actually even went through a little trial, a little test of what to do when they got to the airport. Now, here's Jerry Schemmel again talking about the fact that they knew that they were going to crash. And I've heard some of the cockpit recordings. I think Haynes said it was going to be a rough landing. Did you think it was going to be a crash?
Yeah, I did. And Captain Haynes made sure we understood that. He told us a number of different times to be ready. I know one time, like you said, he said, "This is going to be rough. This is going to be rougher than anything you've ever been through. You need to get ready." Another time he said, "I don't want anybody planning on us landing safely and walking off the plane." And he said, "I want everybody to understand this is not going to be a landing. This is going to be an attempt at a crash landing." He just knew, cockpit crew knew, George, as you well know, that they just had so little control of the plane. They were going to come in way too fast, way too hard. The rate of descent was going to be way past any kind of safe landing zone. They just knew it was going to be hard, and they wanted us to understand that as well, so that we could be ready as best we could as passengers.
Well, that's just stellar, and I want to mention here, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier. Jerry Schemmel has a book called Chosen to Live. You can still get it on Amazon. I mean, my God, it is a great accounting of his life and this horrific circumstance and how he survived. The person that he was traveling with did not. I mean, if you want some inspiration and if you want a great read, get Jerry Schemmel's Chosen to Live. And he's talking about the rate of descent and the speed of the plane. Those guys in the cockpit, they knew that this was not going to be good, right?
Oh, sure. They could not reconfigure the wing for landing. I mean, when you look at an airliner wing, it does a number of things, but it's set for high-speed flight, so it reduces drag, but it also it extends both leading and trailing edge slats to let the airplane slow down to a much more reasonable speed for landing. They couldn't do that. They couldn't reconfigure the wing, so they have no alternative but to use the high-speed wing configuration for this landing, and they only have minimal control. And that is, they can have one at full power, but the other one's almost got to be at idle. That's not enough to maintain level flight, so the descent rate is somewhat driven by that. In addition, there is a natural aerodynamic condition that causes the airplane to pitch up and down, known as a phugoid. And they were having to deal with that. And as they got very, very close to the airport. This pitch down occurred aerodynamically, and they're trying desperately to stop it, but the airplane's now rolling and pitching down, and they're in a position, they're at high speed, and with this pitch down, that's where you see the airplane start to roll in the videos of it, and that's because of this condition known as a phugoid, and they were not able to stop it in time before impact occurred. So they did a remarkable job. It was crew resource management at its best, with 4 extraordinarily talented aviators that resulted in 180 some odd people surviving it.
And you talked a little bit about the impact. Let's go back to Jerry here talking about that.
You can't see it on the videotape, but I am told that initial impact was the right wing hit the edge of the runway first, and when that happened, and then we hit on the belly and the landing gear sheared off, it was complete chaos.
Okay, so, and we've seen, that's KITV, I believe, in Sioux City. That's their film. Somebody standing right outside the chain link fence there at the airport. They rushed there to get what they could. And of course, then we saw this photo just briefly, the aftermath of this. And my God, when you look at this again, it just is amazing that anyone survived this. But Captain, it had a lot to do with these pilots and the staff doing what they did. It also had something to do with the fact they were able to get it to an airport where there were emergency crews. I mean, if this had been out in the middle of the boonies someplace, it probably would not have ended as well as it did.
That's true. And as good fortune would have it, this airport, Sioux City, had done a major disaster drill relatively soon before this occurred. It hadn't been that long. So of all the airports to pick out in the middle of the heartland, Sioux City was uniquely prepared to deal with a wide-body jet airliner arriving under minimal control and to deal with a mass casualty event to maximize the likelihood that the passengers who were injured would in fact survive. So there's a lot of things that came together that day, and a lot of lessons learned that we've learned since because of United 232.
I want to encourage everybody to pick up Jerry's book, as I mentioned, if you like a good read. But also, if you just want to see the show, go back into the archive of podcastbygeorge.com. Watch the entire episode with Jerry Schimmel. It's really good. Here's I'm going to play this because we're just about out of time. This is going to close Jerry's part of this, but this is on the actual stopping of that plane.
Yeah, I remember hitting the ground and seeing all this crazy stuff happening in the cabin, George, with people being thrown about, some still strapped in their chairs, others thrown from their chairs, and in the first couple of seconds after we hit down, and smoke and fire and debris. And then after about 15 seconds or so, maybe a little longer than that, thinking, all right, there's damage here. There's probably some people that aren't going to survive, but we'll coast to a stop and I'll assess things then. That was about the time we flipped over and then slid upside down and backwards for 4,000 feet, at least the piece of plane that I was in. But in 4,000 feet, it had to be at least a minute. It seemed like a couple seconds to me. It really did. It seemed like we flipped over, and I'm holding on. And I'm thinking, don't let anything hit you. Hold on as tight as you can. And about the time I had that last thought, boom, we came to a stop in a cornfield.
In a cornfield. I mean, that's the way a lot of people describe the state of Iowa. That's Jerry Schimmel, folks, and that's United Flight 232. Very tragic day, but there's a silver lining to these black clouds with these accidents. There were changes made. Things were improved. That type of circumstance with that rotor blade and those hydraulic lines, that ain't going to happen again, right, Captain?
That's correct. The certification standards for airliners was changed. And all the airliners now have it's known as a hydraulic fuse, so that it senses if there's a sudden loss in hydraulic pressure, that it'll stop it, and so that everything upstream of that fuse still has hydraulic pressure. So that's one. They've also changed where they route hydraulic lines to, so that a single failure is much less likely to be able to sever 3 separate hydraulic systems. And we've improved the maintenance checking of internal comparts in a jet engine to develop and understand these cracks that can be caught at an earlier stage so that we don't have this type of catastrophic failure. It's called an uncontained failure because it came outside of the engine casing. And they're pretty rare in jet engines anyway, but the engine manufacturers have increased the armor around the engines, and also the maintenance, the manufacture and maintenance of the rotating components, so that they determine and catch these cracks before they get to be catastrophic like this one was.
That's Captain John Cox, folks. He's very generous with his time. We're coming up here on the top of the hour for the end of this particular edition, this live line from Podcast by George. We talked a lot about a lot of things here, Captain. Maybe the most timely is this holiday travel. Let's end there, maybe. Would you advise people just to manage their expectations, or is it to a point to where they might consider an alternative means of getting to their destination? I mean, what's your advice?
I'm flying, across that period of time. I'm going to continue with my flights. The thing that I would encourage you is, if you have a delay where you're going to see a misconnect, or if your flight's canceled, there's two choices. You can either get on the phone and try to reach the airline, which that's probably the best way to go, or you can stand in a very long line and try to get to a customer service agent. One of those two. It's not the staff member's fault that your flight is canceled or late. So please understand that the staff member that you're dealing with is trying to help you. You can be frustrated at the airline. I understand that completely, but please do not take it out on the individual employee, for they're trying to do nothing but help you, and they are as frustrated as you are. So I would encourage you, if to go ahead with your plans, absolutely, because there's a 90 some odd % chance that your flight will go off without a hitch. But if you do find yourself in a condition with a canceled or even a severely delayed flight, work with the airport, with the airline staff, and don't abuse those people, because they're professionals. They're trying to help. They're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem.
That's great advice, as always. What's the status of the masks? Is there a mask mandate on some airlines, others not, or what's that right now?
As far as I know, it is optional on all of the airlines that I'm aware of. I haven't seen in recent travels any of the airlines that are requiring masks, but they do say, and I think this is a good point, let us please respect the decisions of others as to whether to wear a mask or not. That it is an individual decision now, and whether you personally agree with it or not, let's please respect the rights of the decision of our fellow passengers.
Well, that's great, and there may be some inconvenience, and there may be some frustration, but folks, you're not on United Flight 232. I mean, maybe you can look at it that way and remember it that way. Captain, we're out of time. We got to leave it there. Thanks, as always, for coming on this edition of Podcast by George.
My pleasure, George. Good to see you.
Yeah, and folks, if you like seeing Captain John Cox on Podcast by George, if you like this show, please do me a favor. Go to podcastbygeorge.com. Pick a platform that you would like to subscribe to. Facebook and YouTube has the videos. iTunes is a great place. Spotify also to catch the audio-only version. Subscribe, sign up, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That would be great, and you'll be able to catch each and every episode. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George, Live Line.